Hi, I'm Mike Wheeler, a longtime Annisquam guy and a little bit of a fisherman, but we have a guest today, another Gloucester guy, Russell Cleary, who, if I've been to fishing kindergarten, he's got a doctorate in the art and science of fishing. And I don't think I'm exaggerating when I say he is historian of what was happening in the 50s, 60s, coming out of Lobster Cove. Russell, it's great to have you on board.
Thank you. Nice to be here.
It's been a while. You're out in Pepperell, I know, and so you don't have to worry about king tides and things of that sort. But where did you grow up in Gloucester?
Right. I know my great grandparents lived in Upper High Street in Lanesville.
Uh-huh.
My grandfather was born in Lanesville,
Okay,
and
that
my
counts.
father was born in Addison Gilbert Hospital and grew up in Lanesville.
Okay.
And and marriage and the army took him away from Gloucester.
Uh-huh.
And he was in the U.S. Army Dental Corps in World War II. And after World War II, to establish a dental practice, he settled in Concord.
So we're going to talk about, obviously our focus is on Annisquam and Lobster Cove, but Lanesville is not that far away. And a lot of people who were fishing out in Ipswich Bay in the time period I mentioned were, Lanesville was their origin. We'll talk about Fred Breed a lot in that context and others as well. I just thought we could take a look at some pictures here. If we could bring up picture number one, Steve Harris is at the controls here. Picture number one is your dad's boat, Wild Goose. There were several wild geese, I gather, but this one was a real tuna fishing boat with a pulpit and so forth. Can you say a little bit about that vessel?
That was the third Wild Goose, and it was a 33-foot pacemaker. It was bought in late fall of 1961, and we fished it in 1962, 63, 64, 65, and the last year was 1966. And
were you fishing out in Ipswich Bay in that boat or down in Middlebank?
Mostly Ipswich Bay. My father, we didn't have advanced electronics. For a few years, we didn't even have a depth sounder. My father was very cautious. He was a good seaman. He had been a Sea Scout in Gloucester growing up, and he did a lot of tuna fishing as a teenager with Fred Breed. He was quite experienced as a local coastwise mariner, but he was very chary about being out fishing out of sight of land. So when the emphasis was on Middlebank, or even later on Jeffreys Bank, he stuck pretty much to Ipswich Bay and off of Rockport, all within sight of land.
So I'll tell you a story, Russell. I fished, I was low man on the totem pole pulling in fish on Fred Breed's original Jaguar. We'll talk about that. But I was on some other boats occasionally as well, including Ross Lane's Lois B or Loey B. You remember that vessel?
I remember the Lois B well. I have a photo of her.
So the Middlebank, for people who haven't looked at a chart recently, is about 18 miles off Eastern Point, a little south by southeast, and runs down to close to the tip of Cape Cod. And I was with Ross Lane one day. He had no navigational gear, Russell, and it was thick of fog. And we picked our way back in and could hear some surf, and we kind of nosed a little closer, and there was the granite coast of New England. But we had no idea whether we were south of the Gloucester Harbor entrance or north of it, whether we should turn right or left. And ultimately the notion was, well, if we guess wrong and turn left and we're down off the Magnolia shore, we're going to end up at Marblehead. If we turn right You know, we're bound to be okay. We can just find our way up towards Thatcher's and take a left there across Sandy Bay. We didn't have a clue where we were, but we just figured we'd hit North America one way or another. So when we look at, and we had a glimpse of your boat, just so people understand who don't have this background in fishing, that pulpit extending from the bow was for harpooning. But I think of your experience in that boat as more rod and reeling. Am I correct?
Well, my father started harpooning, and he did that with Fred Breed as teenagers out of Lane's Cove with Lang Dooley. Lang Dooley had a boat built by Winchenbaum, who eventually built the first Jaguar, the 38-footer, which is interesting.
And that was up in, the boat was out of Friendship, Maine, I think.
Friendship, Maine is where Winchenbaum's boat shop was.
Yeah.
So both Lang Dooley's boat and which Fred Breed and my father fished on in the 1930s was both that boat and the Jaguar, the 38-foot Jaguar, which Freddie had built, I believe in 1951, were built in Friendship, Maine at the Winchenbaum boat shop. I could be wrong on the build date, but my parents had a photo album of pictures of the launching of the Jaguar. My father was there, I know. I'm not sure if my mother was there. And my vague recollection was it was very early 50s, and I believe 51. I could be wrong on that exact date, but I know my father did fish on the Jaguar with Freddie in 53. But
we'll take a look at the Jaguar momentarily, but before we leave the Clearys, and you're going to bookend this both here at the top and when we wrap up. But if we could bring up that second photo of 11-year-old Russell Cleary cutting up chum on the stern of, I assume, the Wild Goose. You're bent over doing that. Serious responsibility. You've got all your fingers, I trust, even though you're wielding a sharp knife in that case. When you were rod and reel fishing, obviously there were times you probably were trolling. There were other times that you would be just drifting or anchored and chumming. What was the split there? Was it kind of 50-50 as to whether you were in motion or chumming?
My father didn't start rod and reeling until we got the 18-foot Lyman Islander, which was the Wild Goose II. And that's the boat that I was on in that photo that shows me chumming. And he built a fighting chair for the first Wild Goose, the 28-foot hunt form, which sat in our cellar until he rigged the 18-foot Lyman Islander for rod and reel fishing in 1960. And it sort of was a surprise to my father how much more he liked rod and reeling over the harpooning, which he had done for years off and on. I mean, he had done it with Lang Dooley. He had done it with Bob Enos on Bob Enos's Key Waden. He had done it with Freddie on the Jaguar before he had a boat suitable for tuna. Then he bought the Wild Goose, the first one, the 28-foot hunt form. Never put the chair on it, but the chair went into the Lyman Islander and a bow rail on the bow for harpooning. But he really did prefer ultimately the rod and reeling. And we got into the tournament fishing, tournament sponsored by the Cape Ann Tuna Club in 1960. And I know we fished tournaments in 60 through 1964. I'm not sure about 65 or 66, the last years we had the pacemaker. And after that, my brother was no longer part of the crew. He was married and went into the U.S. Army and ultimately in Vietnam. I ended up going sword fishing with Freddie on the schooner Jaguar. And my father got into cruising sail with two fiberglass cruising sailboats that were both named Wild Goose, also based in Lobster Cove.
So deep, deep roots. It's funny, we've talked about boats, we've talked about people. We ought to take a look at picture number 3 to see what we're talking about in terms of tuna on this. These were really big fish, and my sense is, maybe I'm just exaggerating it in time, is that in that period, particularly in the 50s into the 60s, it wasn't unusual to get 5, 6, 700-pound tuna fish. There was a period in the early 60s when I was fishing with Fred where out in the middle bank, we'd see smaller ones, 200, 250 or something of that sort. But do you have any sense about these creatures? I gather that they were up in Nova Scotia, and then it became thicker down here, but you were referring to people fishing in the late 30s out of Lanesville. So maybe they were always here. Do you have any sense of how they've migrated?
Well, we can talk about that photo, which was the 30s, long before my time. That was 1934. My father was 17 years old, and that was a 700-pound plus fish.
Yeah.
I don't have recorded the exact weight, although somewhere in the family stuff there is a newspaper clipping about it. But that was a big fish. That was a 700-pounder. What's interesting about that fish is it had been harpooned by someone else before. There was a wound in it that had healed, not far from where the dart entered from the pole, from heaving the pole into the fish. Not far from where the dart hole is in that photo, there is a healed dart hole. But that was a 700-pounder. And later on, when I started going, it seemed that we had a fair number of 400 or 500-pound tuna fish in the early to mid 60s, but Maine seemed to have bigger fish. It seemed that we had a fair number of 200, 300, 400, 500-pound tuna in Ipswich Bay, which is where we usually fished. And Maine, it seemed, was getting a larger fish in general, or certainly 600, 700 pounders a little more frequently in the 1960s. And Nova Scotia was noted for the granders, the 1,000-pounders. Also, in the 60s, in mid-Cape Cod Bay, there seemed to be a class of giant bluefin tuna that we did not fish often from where we were in Gloucester, but they were huge fish. These were granders. And Keith Wood's wife, Jean Woods, held a woman's world record, 1,002-pounder, I believe it was. And
That's
that
a
was
keeper.
caught in the night in mid-Cape Cod Bay. And those fish seemed to be attracted by the bluefish that were then customarily in Cape Cod Bay, but in the mid-60s were rarely seen in Ipswich Bay. And those big bluefish seemed to attract the really big bluefin tuna, kind of in the same way that those big salmon attract those huge Alaskan brown bears in Alaska. They need all that protein, and those giant bluefins seem to be attracted to those really big bluefish. But we had a lot of whiting off of Halibut Point. We had a lot of herring in Ipswich Bay, and that seemed to be what attracted the fish that we were usually pursuing in Ipswich Bay, the herring.
So you have more experience in Ipswich Bay fishing. We did a little bit of that, and I once hooked a fish fishing with Russie Smith right off Folly Point. I mean, you'd almost throw a ball to the shore at that point. And I didn't know anything but rod and reeling, and I regret to this day that I didn't bring it in, though Russie had lots of more successful experiences with his dad, and we spoke to him not long ago and have his memories on it. On photo number 4, I believe, if we can call that up, that just gives you a sense of what it's like to be working, in the stern of a boat, working a fish in. And I don't have a successful experience in that. But you've mentioned Fred Breed a number of times. Here I am up in Rockholm, and the Breed homestead is maybe 150 yards away, and probably it's less than that. Dr. Breed, was a Medford guy who spent his summers as a youth in Lanesville, got the fishing bug, went off to Amherst College, where he was a great student, Harvard Medical School, and then the Navy. And he was in the Pacific, but obviously felt akin to Cape Ann. And when he opened his general practice, it was in Lanesville. Then he got his ophthalmology training. And he was an esteemed eye doctor. But he took off the robes in the summertime, and he would chase tuna fish. And the next picture we have, it's a little faded, that's Fred Breed, and that's Jaguar, which you mentioned, 38-foot power boat built by Winkenbaugh down east in Maine. Underpowered, Russell. I don't know if you were ever on board that, but that boat had to work really hard to make 6 knots. So getting out the 18 miles to the Middlebank was labor, and coming back it somehow always seemed to take longer. But very well built boat, and an enormous mast in it that allowed him to be up there to spot fish. And if you are harpooning fish, obviously you have to see them. And Fred, not only being an eye doctor, had great eyes. What you can add to this, but what you're looking for is boat wake, but there's no boat. It's the fish under the surface. Occasionally you'd see finning fish, and sometimes it would be very subtle. If the day was choppy, it was harder to see the fish. When you were in your dad's various boats, you didn't have that advantage of altitude, but still you struck some fish. Is that correct?
We did. We did have a flying bridge, so there was a way to operate the boat from above, where you could have a halfway decent view of the sign of the fish. Maybe not the actual fish, maybe just some shady water. And the harpooner on the end of the pulpit would be steering you with the pole. He'd have a better view of the fish, and he would know how he wanted to approach the fish. So you'd follow his direction. But no, we did not. My brother and I have discussed this even in recent years, and we're convinced that my father was just afraid to have a tower or a mast on our boat, because he was afraid of the safety issue with his children climbing. We're not sure that, but we doubt that he wanted the risk of us climbing up in a mast or tower and possibly falling. And however, on the first wild goose, he did have a seat on the top of an extra long gin pole, which seemed to be what Bob Enos had put onto his earlier tuna fishing boat, the Key Waden. But
and the gin pole, just for the record, is the same thing that a well-found lobster boat would have for pulling in the traps, or if you're fishing, for hoisting a large tuna into the boat. It's a mini mast.
Yeah, the gin pole is designed for hauling fish into the boat, and it's offset. It's either on the port or starboard rail, usually the port if the boat was at starboard steering. But what Bob Enos did, and I don't know if anyone else had done this, but Bob Enos had an extra lengthy gin pole, and he put a seat on the top of it. My guess is that in my father's case, when he bought the first wild goose, the 28-footer, he put in a gin pole with the same kind of outfitted the same way for looking from the top of the gin pole. But
I mean, there's no doubt that big mast though gave Fred an advantage. And I remember there certainly were times he could see fish far off, and it just took a long time to get to them. I also remember a time coming in. I told you about the foggy day Ross Lane coming down where it was severe clear. There was no breeze, but there was enormous seas. And I was up in the mast with somebody. It might have been Donnie Ross. It might have been Denny Batchelor. The boat was yawing back and forth, and it got to a point where it did the back, but the fourth was slow in coming. We were at an angle where I was actually thinking, should I jump out into the ocean? Is this vessel going to capsize? And finally, we came back upright. It was an interesting experience. If we look at the next slide, you'll see the Jaguar beached, and it's not as if Fred had run aground, but all those boats, including the lobster boats, would occasionally at high tide run up onto Wingersheek Beach, or as we saw Fred earlier, next to the market or down by the bridge, the wooden bridge, and that would give them a chance to scrape and paint their boats. But you get an idea that Jaguar, the power boat, was a really handsome vessel, beautifully crafted, great lines. And then if we can hop right now to the next photograph, there's Fred on the pulpit. And I don't know how well this is going to show on the video. I assume people won't be able to see it. But if you've been tuna fishing, you actually see the photograph. You can see just on the fish, those little yellow fins beyond the main dorsal fin. You can see those in the water, and I swear I can see a couple of fish to the right of the one that Fred has targeted and thrown his harpoon. We got to say a word about those harpoons, Russell. You've got one. I'm not asking you to rummage around in your barn, but how long were the harpoons?
Probably about 14 feet is my guess.
Yeah.
I'm not even sure if I've measured them, because sometimes it's a matter of what the height is of the end of your pulpit from the water that determines the length of your harpoon. But yeah, Fred was very good with a pole too. He was.
I rarely saw him miss.
He was extraordinarily good.
So it's interesting that he could do that. He also could do delicate eye surgery. But the pole was thrown. You can tell me, maybe it's different when you're sword fishing, if those are on the surface and people who were nailing sharks could just poke them. And Ahab had his experience with Moby Dick, where you're actually next door to the creature. I saw him make some long tosses, and you got to allow for the refraction in the water, and it's a moving target. The pole was wooden. There was a fitting at the end of it, and then the rod was, if it was iron, it was fairly soft. It could bend, and that was intentional. Is that right?
This is a dart or lily iron, depending upon what nomenclature you use. And it is a forward part that is like a spear point, and the after part allows the dart to toggle after pressure when it's been embedded in the fish's flesh, and then some pressure comes on it. Instead of pulling out of the fish directly, the fins on the rear will flatten the dart in the flesh of the fish so that it toggles. It was soft steel, so that after the shank and the dart went into the fish as deep as possible, up to the hilt of the end of the shank, if possible, and the pole would not uproot the dart from the fish that had just entered. Instead, the soft iron would bend, and then the pole would retract, leaving the dart inside the fish, and then with any strain, the dart was designed so that it would toggle once there was a small amount of strain on the warp.
The harpoon goes free of the fish, but is on a leash, so you can recover the harpoon. And then the fish runs with it, and there's a keg at the other end, flotation. At least when Fred was fishing, in my time, we'd get these kegs down at the Gloucester Coal and Lumber, the building center, and there were nail kegs, good size, on that, and they'd be painted some bright colors so you could find them after the fish had run some distance, and they'd haul the fish in that way. Anything you'd add to that?
The keg was to mark where the fish was. You wanted enough warp so that the fish would not pull the keg underwater and possibly pull the dart out of the fish. So you wanted a fair amount of warp. Occasionally the fish would move so fast after being harpooned, it would haul the keg under the water. In fact, Fred told me one time when we were sword fishing south of Martha's Vineyard, he was harking back to, in fact, he harpooned a very large swordfish, a very large tuna when we were on that sword fishing trip. And a mistake was made about snapping a float onto the warp, which is what we used to do with swordfish. And instead, with the tuna rapidly taking off, it pulled the dart. But getting back to sword fishing with the 38-foot jaguar, Fred told me that the largest swordfish he ever harpooned was right off of Lanesville. And he harpooned the fish, it took off, and it took the keg underwater, and it exploded. It couldn't withstand the pressure, and staves came back up, and that's all that he saw. He didn't see any more of the fish or the warp. It was all gone.
Yeah, I never saw a swordfish in Ipswich Bay. I saw two down off of Plymouth when I was on John Shereshevsky's one of his boats. It might have been the 415. I was on the pulpit, but the harpoon wasn't rigged, and they went right under the bow. But they're very rare up here, Russell. Am I mistaken on that?
Yeah, well, did I say swordfish? I meant to say tuna fish off of Lanesville. Did I say swordfish? Fred said that was the largest tuna he ever harpooned, which is interesting because these big fish in Ipswich Bay were within spitting distance of the shore, and that was a giant bluefin tuna fish that Fred said that he harpooned, that he lost because the keg couldn't withstand the pressure underwater. That gigantic tuna that he harpooned just hauled that keg underwater. He was moving so fast.
I remember being down on Lighthouse Beach summers as a kid, and probably 8 years old, something of that sort, and seeing tuna jump clear of the water. So when you say spitting distance, I think you wouldn't want to be too leeward, but
Bonnie Breed Bingle says they used to see them from her house in Rockholm, from the porch.
Well, there's a story, and if it's not true, I don't want to be told this. There was a guy named Carl Ellis who drove for the Gloucester Auto Bus Company. And the story goes that he was driving his bus over the causeway, the Goose Cove Causeway, and he saw fish in Goose Cove, or a fish. He stopped the bus, he ran down to Bunt Davis's at the end of the cove, got a dory, got and by the way, everybody's left on the bus, rows out, has a harpoon, and gets that swordfish. So Carl was on a lot of
tuna fish, you mean?
Tuna fish, yeah. So it's maybe apocryphal, but I'll just add that to the legends here. If we could call up that little faded news clip, it mentions your dad in it, and down, fishing with Fred off Point Judith. I know our focus is on Annisquam and Ipswich Bay. We've talked about that a bit, but this transitions us a little bit. Your father fished with him on board down there, and he's mentioned in that clipping. And then if we go right to the next image, which is the schooner Jaguar, Fred, my sense, Russell, and I don't know whether Bonnie would agree with this or not, but Fred had went out one day in maybe 61, 62, the Middle Bank, and got 40 plus tuna into the old Jaguar, smaller fish, 200 pounds, something of that sort. And I'm surprised that they were able to stay afloat coming back. My impression is that sort of did it for Fred, that he was thinking, wait a second, I love the sport of this, and, we're able to sell these fish cheaply ashore, but it seemed that he was ready for something else, and that was the sword fishing. It was a yacht, right? It was the Lord Jim
Right.
that he bought, a schooner, and then spent a good amount of time repurposing that boat for fishing. What's your recollection of that?
Well, I have a lot of recollections of that, but if I may go back to the clipping, that was 1953. My father did not have a tuna boat at that time. He was actually racing starboats in Rockport, and and he did that with Max Cuny, the artist. But
Really?
and he yeah, that's correct. He had a background in sailing those starboats, but he loved tuna fishing as well. But since he did not have a tuna boat, and at that time he was either tuna fishing with Bob Enos on the Key Waden or Freddie on the Jaguar, he was part of that trip that went to Point Judith. Now I know the focus is Lobster Cove with this, but these are boats from Lobster Cove that would fish occasionally York. If the Boone Island area was productive, Freddie would take the 38-foot Jaguar and fish out of York, Maine. Also, Eddie Burnt with the Hazel Bee also went to York. And the Point Judith trip, I'm not sure, but quite possibly Jack Bodie, who used to come to Lobster Cove in the 1940s with his Jersey Sea Skiff, this Zip, he may have clued Freddie into Nebraska Shoal sometimes being a hot spot for giant bluefin tuna. But that was the destination, and that's where they caught 3 really huge fish. But what was interesting about that trip, an interesting sidelight involving another Gloucester person, was that in that crew was Rick Larson. But
Sure.
Rick Larson was the oculist in Fred's office. And Rick was not supposed to go on that trip to Point Judith in 1953, during which they caught those 3 huge tuna that we had the 8x10 photograph of. Rick went down to the market to see them off. And at the last minute, he decided to stay aboard and go. And my father said he didn't have any clothes to wear. He had street shoes on, but he was able to borrow enough clothing from other men in the crew to get him through the trip. But anyway,
I remember Rick well working in Fred's office, and Rick's daughter, Christine, was a high school classmate in my Gloucester High School. So there are all these connections. But if we
I
can,
just had to throw that in. But okay, back to the schooner Jaguar. That was the Lord Jim. It was owned originally by E. Ross Anderson, who was the Commodore of the Boston Yacht Club. And in assisting it was a 63-foot John Alden designed schooner. And while assisting the Bowden into Mystic Seaport, Connecticut, it wrecked on a reef outside of Mystic, and it sunk. And it was raised. The insurance company sold it to a man that rebuilt the starboard side, almost an entirely new starboard side, reportedly. I'm not sure how much, but evidently extensive rebuilding. And then Fred, in the fall or early winter, I believe it was the fall of 1962, bought that Lord Jim to focus more on the sword fishing. And yes, I do believe that when Fred and in that trip where they caught 43 small bluefin tuna on Middlebank, Fred was there. Two people are still alive that were on that trip. Bonnie Breed Bingle, Freddie's daughter, as well as Donnie Ross. And
I think there was a third person. I think my old friend Johnny Shea, who lived over by the Squam Church, was on that trip too. And I went from Mrs. Pappas's kindergarten all the way through the Gloucester schools with John. I just wanted to give him a tip of the hat because I'm pretty sure he was on board.
I won't dispute that. I wasn't there. I was not there, but I've heard the story from Donnie and Freddie and Bonnie, and I believe that it was a factor that the prices were so low on those small fish that really had not had a chance to mature and probably had not matured enough to contribute to the propagation of the resource. I think that bothered him, and it was 43 fish, and there's no known example of anyone exceeding that in harpooning bluefin tuna in one day that I know of.
For some people, that would have been a great season.
For almost everyone, it would be a great season. If it's a hand-thrown harpoon from a small boat in an inshore fishery, anything like that would be a great season. But he did harpoon 43 in one day. Although in retrospect, he thought that a greater accomplishment was a day that he harpooned 12 really large fish from the schooner on Middlebank. And that was 1961 or 62, I believe. And they pulled the dart on one and they got 11 back, and they were like 600-pound class fish. But
I had very little experience on the schooner Jaguar, but there was experience with you, and Candace and I went down to Menimsha, met up with you, and this was a delivery, really, not a fishing thing. I think maybe the weather might have held us in for a day, and our job was to cook dinner, and we almost cooked the boat. I forget what we did wrong with the stove, but it was pretty dramatic, and we were able to keep the boat from going up in flames. But that was a nice overnight trip home with you, Russ.
I remember you joining us, and I thought that you were very indulgent because you made a salad. In fact, you and Candace were cooking, and you made a salad, and you asked Fred if he thought we should put the dressing on first or after it was, or do it individually. And I thought, well, that's pretty advanced for folks on a sword fishing boat cooking, but it was appreciated.
Oh, good. Well, let's look at, just as we come close to an ending here, this is a picture of a tuna strung up that was part of the tuna tournament. Am I characterizing that correctly, Russell?
11 is the 536 pounder that we caught in 1960, which was for that year the largest bluefin tuna caught in Massachusetts waters in tournament competition.
Right.
And for that, my father did get this governor's cup that was presented at an awards ceremony at the State House in early 1961. And what's interesting about that photo, well, okay, back to that was at Rocky Neck, the Rocky Neck sport fishing dock. To bring a tuna in there and take pictures and have the crowd come in and be impressed with the size of the fish and the fact that you caught it at all was quite an experience for me as a 10-year-old. I'm in the photograph shirtless on the right, and my brother's next to me, who's next to the fish to the right of the fish, and that's my father to the left of the fish. And that was quite an experience for a 10-year-old to take a couple of fish into the Rocky Neck sport fishing dock and enjoy the attention that was being directed at us.
If we could look at that meeting in the governor's office, these tournaments were actually a big deal. That I believe is John Volpe in the middle, governor, and later I think Secretary of Transportation in DC. So this wasn't just some local event. It got a lot of press coverage and so forth. We were lucky to grow up in those times, Russell.
Uh, Right, and what's interesting is, back then it was kind of simple. The only awards being given that day were for striped bass and giant bluefin tuna. Things were pretty simple. Those were the two major sport fish in Massachusetts waters back in those days. And what's interesting about that photo is history is actually being made to a greater extent with striped bass than bluefin tuna in that photo, because the two women both had broken the women's world record for striped bass that summer. They were friends, and they had caught world record breaking striped bass within 20 minutes of each other. So those are the two women that are in the photo. The husband of one of the women is on the extreme right. The first other gentleman from the right after the man on the extreme right, I'm not sure what his background was. And the gentleman standing next to my father, who's on the extreme left, his last name was Hecht, and he had caught the largest bluefin tuna not in tournament competition that year. And that was on Ed Burns' boat, the Hazel B, which was then out of Rocky Neck. He was no longer operating his boats out of Lobster Cove. He was operating it out of Rocky Neck. And that fish was in the 600-pound vicinity, and I believe was caught on Middlebank.
So we've touched a lot of bases, mentioned a lot of boats. There's one thing I want to do at the close, but this is for the historical. I've peppered you with questions. You've been a good sport about addressing them. But what is important for people to know as you think about that era? And what did I neglect to ask you about? Any kind of final thoughts?
Well, in my case, it brought our family together. Even when teenagers were getting rebellious, the boat and the tuna fishing would bring us together. It would also bring my father's hunting and fishing buddies aboard with us, and they would join us for the tournaments. My uncle and godfather, Al McShara, who was local, lived in Lanesville, he would fish with us as well. And what was particularly interesting for me was that as a child, I was exposed to being around adult men for the first time and participating in something with them. It was a fascinating, broadening experience. And these were, of course, older men that we looked up to because of their knowledge and accomplishments. But the giant bluefin tuna fishing and the sword fishing brought me into the company of men in a way that no other activity at that time in my life would have.
Well, it's interesting, Russell, you say that, because Fred Breed was a very important person in my growing up, very influential with me, and I know that there are dozens of other people who would say that as well. I also mentioned John Cherishevsky, and likewise, he was somebody I looked up to and learned from. I mean, no disrespect to some other characters whom I will name, Ross Lane being one, Doc Stanwood. I'm not sure where he got his doctorate, but there were some real characters in the Cove too. And you could have learned very different lessons from them, Russell, I'm sure.
Well, Bob Enos fished with us, and Bob Enos was a kind of a larger than life character too. He was the last of the old time Gloucester sailmakers, and he was an avid tuna fisherman and also a golfer. But he loved tuna fishing out of Lobster Cove, even when he was running a boat that was based mainly out of Burnham and Thomas Yacht Yard in Gloucester. He would bring it to Lobster Cove, sometimes hang on our mooring, tie up at the town float. And that's ultimately where, when he got back into tuna fishing with his own boat, he would keep his boats, Lobster Cove.
Well, as you and I know from other sources, he was legendary in other respects, but we'll leave that for another day and for another topic.
Well, Jack Harrison, who hired him to run his boat, the Shearwater, said to my father later on in life, when Bob Enos is on your boat, it's not your boat.
So one last thing, if we can call up the painting of a tuna fish. We've been talking about tuna. Very, very grateful that Bonnie Breed Bingle shared this image. And there's a tuna busting through the water. You and Bonnie exchanged some correspondence about the color on the bottom of that fish. Can we get a little bit technical on if we want to have something that's accurate in terms of depicting a tuna?
Well, she missed my point was that the first tuna I ever saw, it's the first tuna I ever saw caught was on the Jaguar, the 38-footer, and I was very young. And I remember seeing it being hauled back pretty much dead from the depths. And as it was visible, maybe 10, 12 feet below the surface, I noticed how green it looked. And Bonnie picked up on that and said, gee, it looks silver to me in the photograph. And I pointed out to her that it's only when immersed in the water that the silver appears green. And also, I'll defer to Bonnie because Bonnie saw 43 giant bluefin tuna on the 38-foot Jaguar one time. So she ought to know that they do have silver bellies when out of the water.
And here's the thing that's really lovely. That brings us full circle. That painting was painted by Bonnie's grandfather, Fred's father, Edgar Breed, who was an art teacher and an artist himself, and was in Lanesville, which brought Fred to Lanesville when he was a young boy. There's a picture we don't have in our collection of a bearded Fred Breed, fresh out of Amherst College and shortly to go into the medical school on this. So we've talked about a long era going back to the 30s. And here we are today, what, almost 90 years further along. And these were very formative years when we were on those boats. And I'm so glad, Russell, that you've kept your memories clear on this, that you've got this collection of gear and so forth, and you've been able to join us for this conversation. I'm looking forward to more talk.
You're heartily welcome to anything I know about it.